Okay, so this is the cover of my book, and I show it here because I want to tell you that the cover was inspired, and maybe you've seen it, by the suffragist own artwork. The suffragists here in Ohio, in fact, where I live, a woman named Cornelia Cassidy Davis had this beautiful Let Ohio Women Vote postcard that the suffragists sold in the hopes of passing a state suffrage amendment here in Ohio, which did not pass. But it's one example of the beautiful work and really the variety of strategies that suffragists use to get their message across. So that is the inspiration for this cover. And it is not, in fact, Helen Hamilton Gardner, or HHG, as I call her. So who is Helen Hamilton Gardner? Helen Hamilton Gardner is the most influential suffragist, in my opinion, that you have never heard of. She was the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington, D.C. From 1912 till her death in 1925. And obviously, when she mostly worked to get the 19th Amendment through Congress. And then after ratification, President Wilson was being lobbied to select one woman for a high national post to show symbolically that women now had a full voice in all the nation's affairs. So you can imagine the lobbying for who was going to get this premier position was intense, and who got it was Helen Hamilton Gardner. So she also ends up being the highest ranking woman at the time ever in US government, and a national symbol of what it meant finally for women, or at least white women, as we'll think and discuss, to be full citizens. And to me, what really fascinated me so much about her story was that she started her public life as a woman with a big secret. And that big secret was that she was a fallen woman, meaning that she had had sex before marriage and everyone found out about it. And now when this happened in 1876, that was generally the end of the story. It's the stuff of, every 19th century novel: fallen woman dies sad, horrible death. But something inside Helen Hamilton Gardner made her push back. And she said, no, that sad tale is not for me. So rather than slink away in shame, she moved to New York City, changed her name to Helen Hamilton Gardner, then entered the lecture circuit and became one of the most well-known and influential women writers and thinkers of the 19th century, before turning her attention to suffrage in the early 20th century. So that's a little bit about her and how I came to write this book. Yes, this is a picture of her brain. It's my selfie with her brain. I came to write her story because she figures in my first book, which is the cover you can see behind me. Well, maybe it's kind of dark, but my first book is called From Eve to Evolution: Darwin, Science, and Women's Rights. And in that book, I profile several women who used science for feminist purposes in the 19th century to argue for female equality. And Helen Hamilton Gardner was one of those women. And what she did, and how I first met her, is she was in New York City. She had tried to go to Columbia, but women weren't accepted. So she began following these debates about women in higher education. Why couldn't she go? And the main rationale at the time was that women's brains simply couldn't handle it. They were inferior to male brains. And this man named William Hammond, and I was about to call him some guy, but he's not some guy. He was the Surgeon General of the Union during the Civil War. And then he went on to found and become an early president of the American Neurological Association. So he's the guy. And he had published a study claiming that he had found the exact 19 ways in which women's brains were inferior to men's. And Helen Hamilton Gardner read this and she thought, I'm no scientist, but this makes no sense. So she picked up her pen and she wrote a letter to the editor of Popular Science Monthly, which, as the name suggests, was a very popular magazine in the 19th century that both scientists and non-scientists contributed to. And so she ends up debating Hammond back and forth in the letters to the editor section throughout 1887. And that's where I met her. And then she uses the occasion of the 1888 International Council of Women, which, if you are a women's history nerd like me, you will know that the suffragists convened to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Seneca Falls and to really claim the primacy of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in the movement. So HHG gives a speech at this event, this big international conference, and she talks about her brain research. And she takes it a step further and she says, part of the problem is that male scientists, when they study the sex differences in brains, they compare the brains of eminent men, great men of science who have donated their brains to say, aha, this is why I'm so fantastic. They compare those brains with the brains of women who died in impoverished on the streets or in insane asylums. So she said, this is apples to oranges. Even if there were differences, you wouldn't find them this way. So she implores her audience members to donate their brains to science. Her best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, agrees, signs her brain bequest form to go to Cornell, but her children, when Stanton dies in 1902, her children said that there's no way that this is happening. We will not fulfill, they called her Heathen Helen's request. So when HHG died in 1925, she made sure her brain went to the world's, at the time, largest brain collection for study. And there it is, floating in formaldehyde outside the psychology department at Cornell. You might be pleased to know that the New York Times headline substantiated her lifelong contention that women's brain not inferior to men's. So that's how I met HHG. And this is the part I mentioned earlier. Who was she? And here you can see her in her suffragist lobbying glory days. This is a picture of her from the 19-teens when she was the suffragist lead negotiator to Congress and President Wilson. Carrie Chapman Catt and her colleagues in Nassau, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the forerunner to the League of Women Voters, described her as the, quote, most potent factor in congressional passage of the 19th Amendment. And as I mentioned before, I decided I had to tell her story when I learned about her scandalous affair that she had as a young teacher living in Sandusky, Ohio. And you can see here, her name was Alice Chenoweth. That's her birth name. And the newspapers even printed her name. She was a young teacher, and the Ohio Commissioner of Public Schools, an elected official for the whole state, kept visiting Sandusky. And now this raise some questions because Sandusky is not the capital. It's not the biggest city, doesn't have the biggest school system. Why is this guy constantly in Sandusky? And HHG had the misfortune to board in this house. Those are the current owners. I had fun going to all the houses that HHG lived in, but she boarded in this house alongside the brother and his wife of the owner, editor, and publisher of the Sandusky Daily newspaper. So it didn't take long for the whispers of who's coming to visit Helen Hamilton Gardner, aka Alice Chenoweth, to make it into the papers. So it was reported that she was having an affair with this commissioner of schools who had told her he was divorced, except for, as you already can tell, he was totally not divorced. So young Alice Chenoweth is run out of town, fired from her job, which was basically the only job a middle-class white woman could have in the 1870s. Her family had lost everything in the Civil War, and she was trying to support herself, and she's forced to leave town in disgrace. And this is the part where she reinvents and moves to New York City. And this is a picture of her as she was when she made her public debut in 1884. She entered public life after changing her name to Helen Hamilton Gardner as a lecturer on the free thought lecture circuit. And free thought was a really popular movement in the 19th century, what today we might consider agnostic. And she came up under the tutelage of a man named Robert Ingersoll, who was known as the Great Agnostic. So that's her as she debuted. And so I thought, gosh, what a fascinating woman. I have to tell her story. And what really appealed to me about her is through her various life chapters, I felt like you could see the whole of the women's rights movement, the ways in which bodily autonomy has always been part and parcel of women's demands for political autonomy, that you can't separate the two. And I liked that I could make that point really clearly through her life. And I found many other examples testifying to this. That's a big theme of my book, that in seeking the vote, women often came to that type of activism through concerns about the sexual double standard and or their own bodily autonomy. And secondly, I like that you could see through HHG the many types of causes that women were involved in the 19th century, free thought, science, and how they coalesced together in a stream towards the vote. So that's one theme that I think resonates especially today in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. Here in Ohio, where I live, as you may have heard, we have a huge ballot issue coming up in November, issue 1, where we have a citizens initiative to expand or to protect reproductive rights in Ohio. So we are hopeful that that will pass, but it's been a struggle, and you can imagine all of the obstacles that have been put in our way at every step. So that's still a message that I think really resonates, that bodily autonomy and political autonomy are two sides of the same coin. Okay, that's my first theme. There it is. And then sometimes I frame it as the sexual double standard motivated women to demand the vote, because it was Helen Hamilton Gardner's experience of the fallout from her affair that caused her to begin reading and thinking deep thoughts about the status of women. She wondered, for example, why, and I'm paraphrasing, here she says, this is the frontispiece to one of her first books. She ended up writing 7, that a man is valued for many things, the least of which is his chastity. Why is it then that a woman is valued for few things, mainly her chastity? And so this is kind of the question that prompts her to enter public life and really motivates her all along. I'll skip this part in the interest of time, but we can talk more about it later. The gist of it is that she learned how to legislate, how to lobby, how to negotiate in working to raise the age of sexual consent for girls. You may or may not know that in 1890, the age at which a girl could legally consent, and I'm putting that in scare quotes because obviously there's no consent involved, but the age at which a girl was considered legally able to consent to sex with a grown man was 10 or 12 in 38 states. And in Delaware, it was 7. So Helen Hamilton Gardner focused in on that issue, and that's where she learned how a bill becomes a law, how you make change, how you put pressure on elected officials, how you negotiate with all these mediocre white men in power. And she did this in large part through her writing and her editing of a magazine called The Arena. There she is in the top of this circle alongside Frances Willard of the WCTU down to her left. Well, this is one fun fact I'll tell you. And the point I'm making in the book about this example is, again, bodily autonomy and political autonomy are two sides of the same coin. Through their age of consent activism, suffragists in Colorado got the vote in 1894 and elected 3 women to the state legislature that same year, one of which is Representative Carrie Clyde Holly. And she has the distinction of introducing the very first bill ever proposed by a woman elected official in America. And her bill, as you can already guess, was to raise the age of consent all the way to 18. So age of consent reformers quickly learned that the only states in which they succeeded in raising the age of consent were the states in which women had at least partial franchise, meaning they could at least vote in municipal elections or for the president. And the places where they were able to raise it all the way to 18, which was their goal, were Kansas, Wyoming, and Colorado, the 3 states in which women could vote in the 1890s. So this was a real clear example to women of what could happen, not only when women voted, but also, as you can see with Representative Holly, when women themselves held office. Okay, part 2. The second message we might think about has to do with, how do women make change? What is the best way to put pressure, influence on our elected officials? In this case, even before women had the vote. So long story short, skipping many interesting interludes in her life, HHG moves to Washington, D.C. in 1910 with a man she had recently married named Colonel Selden Allen Day, who was a Civil War hero and career Army officer. They live in this lovely house in upper Northwest DC. where HHG quickly establishes herself as Nassau's most efficient volunteer. She hadn't previously been involved in the suffrage movement. I think she thought it was a little too mainstream, not radical enough for her interests in free thought and sex reform. But when she lives in DC, she immediately joins up. And her next door neighbor is Representative James Beauchamp Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House. So between her proximity to the Speaker of the House, her personal charm, which she wielded brilliantly, and her Civil War hero husband's address book, she quickly becomes the most well-connected suffragist ever. And the suffragists immediately seize upon that. And she's very expert at charming, at making friends with the wives, at getting invited to all the parties and pleading her case in a way that these men, all of whom, both in 1912, both houses of Congress and the president are all in the hands of Democrats, which in 1912 means Southern Democrats, the sons and nephews of Confederates. So, and this is what propels Helen Hamilton Gardner to become Carrie Chapman Catt's right-hand woman and lead negotiator to President Wilson. Gardner really endears herself to Wilson. Carrie Chapman Catt decides she will never go to Wilson alone, only through HHG. And here they are on the steps of the White House during one of their many visits. Gardner cultivated such a close relationship with Wilson, his chief of staff, a guy named Joseph Tumulty, whom she first charmed with one of her lovely letters, and Wilson's second wife, Edith. And she boasted after ratification that she had asked Wilson for 22 favors and that he immediately granted 21. So she's inside the White House this whole time, converting Wilson to become eventually the suffragists' most powerful ally. Now, what this has to do with intergenerational tensions. The first major suffrage thing that Helen Hamilton Gardner works on is the 1913 suffrage parade held in March to coincide with the first inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. She is Alice Paul's right-hand woman in putting together what was, until 2017, the largest women's march in U.S. history. They worked really well together. They had a great time. They succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. But pretty quickly after the parade, they discovered that they hate each other. And they mostly hate each other because they have very different tactics. Alice Paul immediately decides she wants to begin protesting the Democrats, not so much because she's partisan, but because Democrats, remember, control both chambers of Congress and the White House. So she says, we're going to protest all the Democrats. We're going to heckle Wilson. And HHG says, oh my gosh, we're nonpartisan. We can't do that. And furthermore, I've lived a long time. She says, the party in power comes and goes. It could change every 2 years. Why would we alienate all of these people who, we might need as our friends in 2 years? So this really forces not only HHG and Alice Paul, but really all of Nassau and Alice Paul to have a major rivalry, as you all probably know, is over, was to protest or not to protest. What is the best way to get men in power to listen to you? So in part, it was the nonpartisan question. Helen Hamilton Gardner and the other leaders of Nassau held really firm to their nonpartisanship, as we in the League do to this day. But it was also a question of tactics, or as my dad would say, do you attract, I forget the exact, I'm going to maybe mess it up, but he always says something about you'll attract more flies with honey than vinegar. Is that the saying? You get the gist. So Helen Hamilton Gardner was all honey and Alice Paul was vinegar. And it's interesting to think about, which was more effective. And I know that intergenerational struggle is also something we're thinking about. Maybe not struggle, but tension that we're thinking a lot about within the League. It can be challenging to work with folks who have such different worldviews or ideas about how change happens or how things get done or how to run meetings or how to make the website. And this is exactly what the suffragists were dealing with in the teens. And for many years, historians kind of debated who was more influential in the ultimate ratification of the 19th Amendment? Was it Alice Paul and her protesters? Was it Alice Paul and all of those beautiful and brave young women who protested outside the White House and then were arrested and went on hunger strike and force fed? Was it their brave actions? Was it the women of Nassau who kind of kept marching along year after year, doing what they thought was best within their nonpartisan bylaws? And I would say it's both. You couldn't have made the changes that the suffragists made if it was just the Alice Paul way or just the Nassau way. And to illustrate that point, I want to just share one quick story about how Helen Hamilton Gardner made her way into the White House for the first time. So it was the spring of 1916, and she had spent the previous winter in California, and she came back to DC, and all of her Nassau friends immediately told her, oh my gosh, you won't believe what Alice Paul and her, young hellions are up to, chasing the president around, heckling him. And Helen Hamilton Gardner thought, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. So she wrote this big letter to Woodrow Wilson's chief of staff, and she's included her calling card and a list of references, basically a lot of her congressional friends and their wives who would vouch for her. And she said, I really want you to know, Tumulty, that not all suffragists are hecklers. I'm a member of Nassau, and we are not hecklers. We are nonpartisan. You would love to work with us. So she writes all this in a letter. Then she attaches two things. One is a memo that outlines the differences between Alice Paul's National Woman's Party and her group Nassau. And then she writes in her own hand, the rest was typewritten, a PS. Does Mrs. Wilson ever accept callers? And she said, as the wife of an Army colonel, it would be my honor to call. Well, guess who went to the White House the very next day? You can see Tumulty's handwriting next to her, the PS saying, tomorrow, 10:30. So with that, she's in. And then Tumulty goes on to use the memo she wrote describing the differences between the two groups to explain to Wilson who's who. And this really surprised me because now it's 1916. He's been president already for 3+ years, and he still has no idea who is who. And this comes up because Carrie Chapman Catt requested a meeting with him. And Woodrow Wilson writes in his handwriting, are these the hecklers? And Tumulty says, no, Carrie Chapman Catt's not one of the hecklers. Look, here's this 4-page memo. You might like these ladies. And so Wilson says, okay, fine, my office. And so not only does Helen Hamilton Gardner get into the White House, so does the rest of the Nassau leadership. But what made President Wilson open to this entree from Helen Hamilton Gardner is the fact that Alice Paul was protesting, and he knew he had to meet with a suffragist, and he certainly didn't want to meet with Alice Paul, but she's the one who pressed the issue. So that's why I say I think it's a both and not an either or. The final point I want to leave us with tonight that I think free thinker and the example of Helen Gardner really helps us think about, and also in a modern context, is how racism shaped the trajectory of the 19th Amendment and continues to impact voting rights today. So my example of this is Helen Hamilton Gardner was one of her main jobs was to try to convince a couple more senators to pass the 19th Amendment. The House had passed it in the beginning of 1918 in January. And it passed it pretty easily. So the women at first thought, oh, great, we'll be through the Senate, no problem. But instead, it was languishing in the Senate, and they kept coming up a couple votes short. And they knew they needed at least a couple Southern Democrats to vote yes. Remember, the Southern Democrats are still in charge of both houses of Congress. So Gardner goes to her friend, John Sharp Williams, who was known to be really educated. He loved reading, he loved writing, they were pals. And she writes in this impassioned letter saying, you do the right thing. You know this is coming. You want your children and grandchildren to be proud of you. You want women like me and your daughters to be voters. Just do the right thing. And he wrote her back the next day, and he said, oh, this is HHG's letter to him. You can see she's really laying it on thick. I want you to redeem your state. You are its leading citizen. Do the right thing. And then his reply, which really surprised me for its frankness, says, I would never vote for the 19th Amendment. He said, first of all, he said, the 15th Amendment was awful. And everyone in the South hates it. And the 19th Amendment would only enhance it. And it might force the federal government to actually enforce voting rights in the South, which it had not been doing. Second of all, he said, Black women would go to the polls in Mississippi and white women mostly wouldn't. And he goes on to say that, and everyone knows the reason why Black men in Mississippi don't vote, it's not because of the various bars that the state had enacted against them. It's because, he writes at the bottom, they know if they do vote, some of them might get hurt. So here he's blatantly saying we use violence to keep Black men from the polls. And on the next page, he says, but we could never do that with women, with Black women, because they are women after all. So this becomes the central point of contention in getting the 19th Amendment passed. If you had been a fly on the wall on June 4th, 1919, when the Senate finally did pass the 19th Amendment, you would have been very confused. You would have thought they were talking about the 15th Amendment. All of the old objections about women voting will destroy the family, or women aren't smart enough to vote. No one is saying anything like that in 1919. The only objections are that senators from both parties in all regions did not want to enfranchise Black women in the South. So that is the sad compromise that white suffragists like Gardner pictured here, along with Maud Wood Park, the first president of League of Women Voters, at the signing ceremony for the 19th Amendment. Why is Gardner there? Because she organized the signing ceremony. She even bought the fancy gold pen that the vice president and speaker of the House used to sign it before sending it to the states for ratification. But I want you to remember not just the fancy gold pen, or really not even the fancy gold pen, but the fact that the way the 19th Amendment got through Congress is that both Alice Paul's group and NASA essentially made a devil's bargain and said, just pass the 19th Amendment and we won't say a peep about enforcement. We will never go to the South. We will never encourage the 19th Amendment to be upheld to ensure the voting rights of Black women. Just give us the 19th Amendment and carry on discriminating against Black women, just like you've been doing against Black men since 1877. And that's pretty much what happens, and why it's not until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that the 19th Amendment really becomes a reality for all women. The slides that I skipped, or sometimes I end with questions about memory. Whose stories do we remember? Whose stories do we forget? And that's where I come back to the gold pen and how smart Gardner was. The reason she bought the gold pen is not so much because she wanted to celebrate the congressional passage of the 19th Amendment, because she already had a plan. Immediately after the gold pen was used to sign the 19th Amendment, the next day she wrote to the Smithsonian and she said, hey, I've got this fancy gold pen that was used to sign the 19th Amendment. And I also have all of these wonderful historical artifacts that have been in the Nassau, DC headquarters. Susan B. Anthony's Red Shawl, the desk that the 1848 resolutions were written on. I think these artifacts should go to the Smithsonian, and you should make a huge exhibition documenting women's contributions to American life. So that sort of comes to pass, but the exhibition that results, and which is really almost until 2020, the main way that our national museums recognize the suffrage movement, was a teeny exhibit held, like, you know, when stairs go up and then change directions, there's like a landing. So they put the suffrage exhibit on the staircase landing and called it an important epic. Some of the things I'm so excited about with regard to the League of Women Voters today is the way in which I think we're doing such a better job than our foremothers with regard to race, and the way in which we are reckoning with our past mistakes and really centering diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything we do. So I'm really so proud and honored to be a part of that. And I really see our transformation work that we're doing nationally and locally and state at every level in line with what Carrie Chapman Catt decreed in 1916. She said, I'll be president, but only if everyone gets on board with what she called her winning plan. And she said in her presidential speech at the 1916 conference, at which President Wilson gave opening remarks, and she said, you know, we haven't really ever tried all that hard for the federal amendment. We haven't gone all in before. What would it be like if we did? And so she made all of her state leaders pledge to support her plan. And lo and behold, less than 5 years later, the federal amendment had been ratified. And I see a similar process unfolding with our new goal, our new priority, the moonshot goal of abolishing the Electoral College. So, oh, okay. I see a question. Some of it can see HHG as distastefully manipulative. Did I get that reaction much? No, I didn't. That's the first time I got that reaction. I wonder, um, distastefully manipulative of her colleagues, of the men she worked with, of everyone. Say more. I think she was maybe opportunistic. Oh, the people that she was informally lobbying. I think she loved her informal lobbying. And I think she saw it as kind of an ideal combination of her winning personality, her sterling intellect, and her political commitments. I mean, she really liked all these people. She loved Wilson. She loved his wife. She's the only suffragist that stayed in touch with him after his stroke. All the other suffragists pretty much abandoned him. She still called him. She still wrote him letters. She went to his house to visit him. She really felt like they were close friends. And she appreciated that and stayed in touch. Um, and the same with several of the others. John Sharp Williams, he didn't do what she wanted. They stayed in touch. She was good friends with him and his daughter. And then when she got that plum appointment to the U.S. Civil Service Commission as the highest ranking woman, that was the first time in her life. And she was in her late 60s at that point. That was the first time in her life since she had been a teacher in Sandusky that she had a regular paycheck. And so she relished, she thrilled in giving her friends gifts and putting her namesake favorite niece through college and basically sharing what she had with all of her friends. So I think her friends, at least based on what they wrote in their letters and in her eulogy and what they remembered about her, her friends adored her and felt that she was a friend to the end. Elizabeth Cady Stanton too, Ingersoll, also kind of speaks to my work as a teacher and why I love teaching so much. This semester, I'm teaching my women's history class, and a big theme of that is about how we mark and remember women's contributions on our landscapes and our street names and our building names, things like that. So this is very much in line with my teaching interests as well. The students in my women's history class do a final project about historical memory, where they have to propose a building or a street or something be named for a particular woman that's meaningful to them. And they come up with really great projects, and it's always super inspiring. So this point is, I guess, kind of like my mission statement in life. At one point, I thought I was going to be a minister. That was a long time ago. And instead, I have become an evangelical for women's history. So why am I an evangelical for women's history? Because I think that the stories we tell about our past shape what we think is possible in the present and in the future. So the extent to which we remember, we recognize, we celebrate, we grapple with, we challenge the stories and contributions of women in the past, the better we all are today. And this, I think, is what Helen Hamilton Gardner believed as well. So this is a picture of her being sworn in as U.S. Civil Service Commissioner, one of three, and to hold this post, and it's just one notch down from a cabinet secretary. So this is the post she held from 1920. She was appointed by the Senate or appointed by Wilson, confirmed by the Senate in the spring of 1920, a few months before the 19th Amendment was ratified. And she served until her death in July 1925. And these, I think, were really the happiest years of her life. And when she wasn't busy doing her civil service work, she was working very hard to shore up the memories of the suffragists. And in fact, her last public speech or her last speech at all, was held just a few weeks before she died. And it was at the Nassau Looking Backward luncheon in DC. And it was 5 years. It was to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And various speakers said various celebratory things. And when it was Helen Hamilton Gardner's turn, she said, you know, everyone's been singing what she called the praise side of the song, but she wanted to tell a different story. And she said, you know, even though it's only been 5 years, I wonder how many of the women in this room know the names of the women who came before. How many of us know the women who toiled in obscurity for generations in the 19th century, knowing they would never see the vote, knowing that their names would be lost, and nevertheless spent decades working for this goal. How many of us know their names? And then she mentioned some of their names and told some of their stories. And then she said, you know, we're having this luncheon here in Washington where during Gardner's tenure, she had watched the erection of various Civil War monuments, various statues, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument. And she said, out our window, we can see Arlington National Cemetery, where the great heroes of our many wars have gone to be celebrated and honored. And she said, where's our Arlington? Where do our heroes go? And she said, our heroes lay in graves little known, little recognized, scattered all across America. And she said, it's our duty to remember them, to tend to their graves, metaphorically speaking, to tend to their memories and keep them evergreen. And those are her last remarks. And I feel like that's still a really potent message today. And she also did this work, as I mentioned, through the fancy gold pen. Here it is. She had it inscribed. You can see if you crook your head, used in signing the women's suffrage amendment. And then she sent it immediately to the Smithsonian for the exhibit that turned out to be kind of disappointing, but nevertheless, she had a big vision, a bold vision for this. And this is the picture that I love of her. When she settled in DC in the early 1900s, she was known for her love of horses. She had 2 white Andalusian horses, Caro and Baru, and she would ride them about the streets. And this is her in front of one of those many Civil War monuments that she had watched be erected while she lived there. And I think this is Thomas Circle, General Thomas. And you can see she's posing kind of like the monument. And I think she's saying in some way, where's our monument? Where's the monument to women's suffrage? Where's the monument for all of the women who have sacrificed so much, toiled in obscurity, and dedicated their lives to empowering voters and protecting democracy? So that's her message, and I hope that we heed it, and I really appreciate your time. I have many thoughts about this. I think a real strength of the League is the older women that run it. I think the collective wisdom that we have is remarkable. And but at the same time, I think that we will be so well served by recruiting and by encouraging women who are not retired, younger women, to join us. And when I look around in my age group, I'm in my late 40s, and I hear my woman friends or my mom friends being amped up about issues, this and that. What are we going to do? I say, what are we going to do? We're going to join the League of Women Voters. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The wheel already exists. It's been running very smoothly since 1920, over 100 years. What we need to do is join this fine-tuned organization. I think, so if you care about women's rights, if you care about voting rights, if you care about democracy, this is the place to be. So I think it's twofold: celebrating and really savoring and recognizing the accomplishments of our longtime members, while at the same time welcoming, encouraging, and messaging ourselves in such a way that younger women see the League as a place for their efforts.